And I'm back. So here's the hydrometer. It is this device that floats, just barely floats in a water-based solution that is either pure water, grape juice, or wine. And in grape juice, it floats the highest. In high alcohol wine, it will float the lowest. Lots of alcohol, it sinks more. And you just measure on the stem that's sticking up a number that tells you the density of that liquid. And from the density, you can calculate what the percentage of alcohol is. So this just explains exactly what I'm talking about. You take a sample of the juice, you put it into a graduated cylinder, add the hydrometer, and wait. Once it's stabilized, you measure, record it, you're done for the day. And you put it in a cylinder so you don't have the cap. You don't want all of these skins floating at the top in this fermentation chamber. That would mess up your flotation. It might hold it up, it might push it down. So you want to make sure you have just the juice and not all of the solids in the way. So that's why they do it this way. You don't just drop the hydrometer directly in the fermentation tank. Typically, grapes will accumulate about 25 to 26 Brix, 25 to 26% sugar, or 25 to 26 grams of sugar per 100 milliliters of juice. It's all the same thing. If it goes up after that, it's because you've passed the ripeness, and any additional sugar content is because the grapes are starting to dehydrate by being overripe. Winemakers will allow a crop to hang on the vine and dehydrating for flavors to develop. That might be something you want to do, but you need to make sure your vineyard manager or vineyard owner is aware of your plan, because as your grapes are losing water for the flavor to develop, every drop of water that evaporates is money evaporating out of the pocket for the vineyard owner. When they sell you that grape, that water is weight that they would sell you. So you need to make sure they know, they agree, the price that you've agreed to is appropriate. If you're paying by the ton price, or maybe you're paying by the acre price. You've already evaluated the field and you pay by the acre. And then the vineyard manager doesn't care if you go a little bit extra time and dehydrate them, because he's not getting paid by the ton, he's getting paid by the acre. There are different ways. You can set it up any way you want, as long as everybody's happy. But during the hang time, the grapes will shrivel and lose some weight. And so you must negotiate prices that can either be based on an increased ton price for this, or you can go to an acre price if you're comfortable doing that. Winemakers who like to develop flavors should negotiate an acreage contract so you keep a happy relationship with your grower. Do you have to? No. I mean, you can give a favorable tonnage price, but still, it's just stressful for the owner of the vineyard. If you've negotiated a favorable tonnage price, they're still watching the evaporation of the berries evaporating their profits. No matter how good of a price you give them, they want you to get it out there. It's like, yes, I've got a great price. Get those grapes out now before they dehydrate any further. And so you want to make sure that everybody's comfortable, and the acreage price is a good way to deal with that. So what about ethanol predictions? If I have the initial Brix at the crush pad before I even start my my fermentation, I can estimate the percent alcohol, the volume of alcohol per volume of finished wine is an A plus X times Brix. And X is a variable, an adjustment on the Brix number that varies within a relatively small but important range between 0.51 and 0.66. And different varieties have different influences on ultimate alcohol production and the way the yeast behave as they're living in that variety for the fermentation period and dying in there. And then A is a number ranging from anywhere from a great distance of negative 4.91 to 4.37, and it compensates for other soluble solids in the mixture. So there is no one magic number. Some people say, oh yeah, you can take the Brix from any grape and do just one simple calculation and convert it without even knowing what the grape is. If you know Brix, you know alcohol. And that's not true. If you know Brix, you can calculate alcohol, but you have a pretty broad range that it might be based on soluble solids and other factors. It's a little more complicated than just Brix going directly to alcohol. You can thumbnail it, but to be more accurate, you need that equation and some more details. So the final alcohol content is extremely important. And so you want to know when you're looking at those grapes and you're planning a fermentation, you need to know what that ultimate alcohol content is going to be. Now, there are some wines, in particular the four I've got listed here, Port, Marsala, Madeira, and Sherry, are fortified wines. And that means there's extra alcohol added. And that means you have to sell it as a high alcohol wine. And the taxes on that are higher, so they tend to be more expensive. In addition, there's something like vermouth used to mix certain mixed drinks with hard liquor. Vermouth is used in a number of things. Sherry is used in cooking frequently or as a drink. But this is called an aromaticized wine, vermouth. So these are special situations. Certainly the alcohol content affects flavor dramatically. The higher the alcohol content, the more noticeable the alcohol is in the flavor. That can be good, that can be bad, depending on what your ultimate wine is. Consumer preferences, what do the consumers prefer to drink? And with taste tests and other things, there's a sweet spot for a different kind of wine. Where are you going to get consumers saying, oh, wow, I really like that one? Alcohol is part of that flavor mouthfeel. One of the biggies is taxes. And I haven't looked this up since 2017, but the rates change over time. Federal taxes differ by content, and I'm almost positive there has not been any change in the percentage categories, but wines up to 14% alcohol by volume are taxed at $1.07 per gallon. So you have to pay the government $1.07 for every gallon of wine, and that's roughly 4 typical bottles, or about. Wines between 14 and 21% have a higher price, an additional 50 cents per gallon, $1.57. These numbers may have gone up a little bit, they may be the same, but the categories, the 14 and 14 to 21, the break points are the same, I'm sure. Wines between 21 and 24, these fortified wines, ooh-yah, $3.15 a gallon. That's a lot of money just going to the taxes for selling that wine. And as the producer of the wine, you're the one paying that tax. Now you're going to pass the cost on to your customer, but that means high fortified alcohol wines or very high fermented wine percentages of alcohol have a very high cost in taxes. And so if you look at a lot of consumer wines in the grocery store, you're going to see 12%. Why 12%? It's not only something that has shown to be a good consumer preference, but you're falling in below that break point of 14%. You don't want to get it too close. You don't want to be, wow, 14%. So I can do, 13.9%. There's too much variability. When a wine says it's 12%, it's 12% plus or minus, and there's some slop in that number. 12% is an approximation. They're not going to do an individual percentage on every batch of wine. And they're going to measure it. They're going to know what it is. But when they label it, they're not going to make custom labels for every one. Oh, this one's 12.8. This one's 11.65. They're not going to do that. But in reality, that is what's happening in the wine. Now you can adjust that to get more accurate by blending, but you don't want to be targeting a 13.5% wine because I can still get away with the $1.07 per gallon taxes and give a little extra kick for my customer. Some customers, some consumers, they want every drop of alcohol they can get. That's why they're drinking the wine. They enjoy the taste, but they are doing it for a social buzz. What happens if you get a little higher due to the slop in the system? I'm targeting 13.5 and I end up with 14.1. And somebody just happens to test that from the government. You're going to be in trouble. And you're going to not only have owed the $1.57, but you're going to have great penalties for putting something in as a below 14% wine that wasn't below. They're really strict on those caps. But ethanol content, very important topic, something that you have to monitor very carefully. You also have to make sure that you keep extremely good records because alcohol is so controlled and the taxes are so controlled by the federal government. You have to have accounting records that show every grape that comes in and every drop of wine that goes out. The organic acids, the principal organic acids are tartaric and malic acids. Those are the primary two acids you find in wines. The tartaric is the most abundant. I'm not too worried about the stereochemistry of this, but if you've ever heard of Louis Pasteur, great. He's the person credited for developing the pasteurization process for things like milk. It is stable to microbial fermentation, but it will form insoluble salts with potassium. So tartaric acid can combine with potassium, forming K2TAR. And that will get on the bottom of the cork or the bottom of the bottle in aged wines. And there's also something very closely related, KH, potassium hydrogen TAR, which is the tartaric acid component. And when it forms, that's the cream of tartar. Maybe you've seen that in the spice aisle. Maybe you've used it in baking. It is something that is commonly used in baking. So a very closely related compound, the cream of tartar. or some people say cream of tartar, but tartar is like tartar sauce you use for your shrimp. This is actually cream of tartar. Malic acid, the second most abundant, certainly can be metabolized by yeast and bacteria. Another important acid. And these acids give tremendous influence to the flavor of the wine. So we measure the acids by titrating with a known concentration of a chemical indicator, a base, generally sodium hydroxide, and we monitor the pH as we're adding the sodium hydroxide in a process called titration. And that will give us a number when we measure it that way. How much sodium hydroxide do we need to add to reach a breaking point of the acid to get the pH up to a set point? And that's a measure of the titratable acidity. How much titratable acidity or buffering or resistance to change in pH is in that wine. The direct pH, you can use a pH meter or a very quick and dirty way, litmus paper. Litmus paper gets you in the ballpark. It gets you an approximation, which can be good enough for some situations. But litmus paper is just a color change paper, and it can't tell you in as detailed a measurement, as accurate a measurement. So a meter is generally used in the lab when you need an accurate measure. Organic acids, you generally have as much as 8 grams per liter, maybe down to 6.5 grams, so relatively modest range. pH ranges of wine tends to be just below 3 to about 4 pH, with the whites typically being in the 3 to 3.3 range, so quite acidic, quite acidic. Right down there with lemon juice, almost, not quite. But lemon juice isn't much more acidic than this. They taste way different, though. Red wines tend to be just a tiny bit higher at 3.2 to 3.4 range, a tiny bit less acidic, which surprises some people. Some people say, aren't red wines, a little harsher flavor? Isn't that more acid? And that's not more acid. That's some of the other compounds like phenolics that we are tasting that give red wine its what some people call harsher flavor. So here's a machine for measuring the titration. Can be done very quickly using a machine like this. It's got a pH meter probe right here that is monitoring the pH as a base is being slowly dripped into the solution. And when the pH gets to a certain point, it stops and measures how much of the solution had to be pumped in. Very simple setup once you get it going. And you can manually do a titration to measure titratable acidity this way. You've got the sodium hydroxide going into the wine, and you're measuring the pH, and you're monitoring exactly how much sodium hydroxide you added to get to the break point. Other parameters, the anthocyanin and tannin content in red wine grapes. Anthocyanin is a pigment that is an important flavor component that gives the red color. Much of the color is anthocyanins, and tannins are a common component. It's actually a pesticide for the plant. It helps the plant protect itself from fungal and bacterial diseases. So technically it is a natural pesticide. We use tannins to tan leather, to keep leather from decomposing. If I were to skin a cow and turn it into a shirt without treating it properly, it would start to decompose and stink, and it would be horrible. You have to treat the leather with salts and tannins and soften the leather, and now you can turn it into an article of clothing. So that tannin is acting as a chemical agent that includes a preservative or pesticidal property that you put into the leather. So when you're drinking a nice glass of red wine, these wonderful tannins are pesticides giving flavor components. Yay for those flavorful pesticides. There are also important ring compounds called phenols. They form a molecular ring structure, and there are lots of types of phenols. It's a category, not a single thing, but a category of molecules that's found in living things, including wine grapes. And very common in the white grapes as important components of flavor. Grape and wine relationship not well established for either because of processing effects. So there's so much that we do in processing choices and winemaking techniques that it's really hard to have a generalized rule about how these components affect flavor and wine quality. Aroma components. These are things we smell as well as taste. Our smell and our taste are intricately linked, and we can't separate them. If you try and take smell out of the taste equation, your taste goes right down to next to nothing. For many flavor components, you can't taste very much without smell. And so aroma is really important, but it's extremely hard to measure. There have been advances in aroma measuring in the last decade, but we've got a long way to go trying to get machinery that can smell in a way that is meaningful to a winemaker. We're not there yet, not even close. Certainly the methodologies for measuring aroma are difficult, very tedious, and I have not seen anything that is a production scale device. It's more laboratory experimentation. There are people working on it, but it's certainly not something where I've seen wineries using measurements to effectively measure aroma, with one exception: the human nose. And there are specialists in wine tasting, some wine tasters that are phenomenal in their ability to detect things, but that's different. When you have a finished wine, if you're lucky enough to have some of these really, really good tasters on your team, they can be invaluable, not only to give you feedback, but to help you develop the finished products that you want for your customers. Tasting grapes. Contrary to myth, no one can accurately estimate the sugars and acid by taste. You can't just taste it and know what the Brix is, and know what the acidity is, know what the titratable acidity is. You can tell taste components, and you can tell aroma components, and you can make important estimates by taste, but you can't replace the measurements of Brix acidity and titratable acidity. So a tasting panel, including the winemaker and the grower, are often used with an examination of these things we've looked at: sugar, acid, color, and flavor. And these tasting panels are very, very important. Experience will provide perspective on varietal aroma, color, and balance. And I'm not going to get into the vocabulary of tasting, but we talk about all kinds of things in tasting You can read up about it or watch some YouTube videos on it if you would like. But when you're talking about the balance of the wine or the different components of flavor and aroma, there's a lot of vocabulary that some people think it's snobbery or people just kind of making it up, but it really isn't. Uh, the vocabulary does make sense if you're experienced, and it's useful to the winemaker, even though it might not be useful to somebody who's grabbing a bottle of wine at Food for Less or wherever. You just want to grab something and enjoy it. You don't care about all this fancy vocabulary. You just say, hey, this one, I like it. It tastes good. And for a lot of people, that's all that matters. But to get there, to understand that, to compare your wine that you're drinking today that you're liking to another one, the experts in wine tasting are a very valuable part of the industry. And through this wine tasting, a database can be built to help understand the objective measures, acidity, titratable acidity, pH actually, for acidity, pH, titratable acidity, color can be an objective number that can be measured by a machine. The Brix is objective. Flavor and aroma, that's the subjective components. That is opinion. So objective data, measurements that don't have any opinion attached to it. It's just scientific data. Subjective is your opinion. And they try to avoid using words. This tastes good. I like it. Those are words a consumer might use. A taster is going to stick to things with words that are as objective as possible. You know, high acidity, taste, strong aroma of fill in the blanks, whatever aroma component they're smelling. They try to stick to just saying what they're experiencing and not qualifying it with good or bad and words like that. Harvesting practices, the primary objectives: pick all the grapes as fast as possible with minimum damage and do it as cheaply as possible. Sounds pretty straightforward. Certainly that sounds impossible maybe, but they're doing it all the time. The condition of your fruit at harvest when it reaches the crush pad is going to have a major impact on the ultimate wine quality. So if you damage the product too much during harvest, if you harvested a white wine grape too hot on a hot day, that's not good. There are lots of things that you can do at harvest that can improve or reduce the quality of the wine ultimately. You also have competition with birds. When it's great for making wine, it's also great for making happy birds out in the field, out in your vineyards. So when you start seeing birds coming in and starting attacking your vineyards, that's actually a great way from a distance to say, oh, wow, those grapes must be ready for harvest or close to harvest. Because just when harvest is just nearing, the birds know it. And they always come in a week or a few days before harvest and start doing as much damage as they can. Early morning harvests tend to be good because you can process cool fruit, and sometimes really early morning when it's still dark out, especially for the white wine grapes. But that can be a problem as well. Manual versus machine harvesting. Manual harvesting can be quick. There is some selectivity potential for machine harvesting. Very thorough. You get a lot of a lot of the grapes, you're getting everything you want. You're only leaving behind those you selectively didn't cut. So manual harvesting is quick, selective, and thorough, minimal damage, but it's high labor, so it's expensive. The only bonus is you're also getting paid for the rachis. You're not leaving the rachis behind. Machine harvest is a lot cheaper, even though the initial equipment costs are huge. They pay for themselves if you've got large acreage to do. But you also have some damage to the vines and reduction in yield because of that. You're stressing the vines through this massive shaking, and you're shaking the grapes off of the rachis, so the individual grapes fall into the harvester collection portion, and you lose a little bit of juice in the process. Not much, but you are damaging things. It's not as perfect a solution as some people think it might be. And it's also dangerous in some vineyards, and it's not possible in some vineyards, especially with some vineyard trellis designs. So I've already mentioned this. Trellis design must be able to withstand machine damage and make fruit easily accessible to the machine mechanism. So again, there's a lot of considerations. With manual harvesting, labor is getting harder and harder and harder to find. People who know how to hand harvest grapes and are available to it, not working for somebody else already, it's getting harder every year. So that is an introduction into wine making.